Hi everybody, Steve here, and let's talk Rear Window. Rear Window is a really fascinating film when it comes to adaptation and really what Hitchcock is doing. And often when a director is expanding a short, what they're doing is they're stretching it into different locations. And often what the adaptation really becomes is rethinking it through location and moving it into different locations that say a short story doesn't have the time or the scope to actually do. And what Hitchcock is doing is he's keeping it within one closed set, really, but he's giving you great detail. And he's giving you great detail through this closed set, and I think it's a really, really successful adaptation through it actually working in that medium of sort of those one set kind of movies. You know, when we think of a film like, say, Reservoir Dogs, or those sorts of films, and it just works. It just works really, really successfully, and that's what I want to concentrate on today, or this week, really. Just the way that he's able to flesh out a really interesting adaptation that seems very scenic. It seems to always be moving into different places, even though the camera is actually located in Jeff's apartment for the entire duration of the movie. So when we're talking about Leach's modes, the first mode to consider is, of course, revision. And what's different to the short story is that in the movie we essentially have two key females. We have Stella, who I'll talk about in a few minutes, and we have Lisa. And Lisa is Jeff's boyfriend. Now, Cornell Woolrich, who wrote the short story, was gay. And he wrote a lot of stories about men looking at other men and kind of the peeping toms and things like this. And he was sort of published in, the sort of the queer mags of the 1950s, those sort of underground queer mags. And It Had to Be Murder, his short story here, was always considered a queer text, where you've actually got Jeff, who is gay, and he's looking into other apartments to sort of check out any kind of, I don't know, hot blokes that are there. Now, it's kind of hard to think of the story like that today because we're so influenced by Hitchcock and what Hitchcock did with the text and the way that he kind of populated the movie with prominent females. And the prominent females aren't just there to look at, even though there are some females that are kind of there to look at, like Miss Torso, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. But the characters were really integral to the movie and to the plot, and they pushed the plot forward in ways that, well, they're just absent from the short story, where the short story is really about one man looking at another and one man trying to work out the behavior of another. And that's very, very different. So he does kind of revise the original story through Lisa and what she actually is able to bring to the short story. And of course, it's Grace Kelly, and it's one of Grace Kelly's really brilliant roles. I think all of her films with Hitchcock are probably her finest, but this is really an amazing performance. It's certainly celebration. If you think about what's actually going on here, is he's celebrating the short story. He's giving great acknowledgement to the short story being a work of genius almost. The way that he's not wanting to move away from the apartment. He loves the idea of a film set in a single apartment. And what's going on in the story is we're seeing images, and what's going on in the film is we're showing images. And that's what Hitchcock's doing. He's kind of dancing with that whole idea of seeing in one form to showing in another. And often when we're talking about adaptation and what is an adaptable text and what is an unadaptable text, often when we're talking about adaptable text, what we are talking about are the texts that actually are giving us images that we can think of in a cinematic kind of way. So if we think of this, It Had to Be Murder, if we think of Don't Look Now, what's actually going on there is there's not a lot of time spent of what the characters are thinking or things that can't be shown. What's actually going on in those stories is really clear images, characters looking at particular things and the prose describing those particular things. So when we come to a film, what the film is doing is it's showing us those particular things. And that's very important. And that's where we get the very adaptable text and what's actually going on. And a lot of these pulp writers from the 40s and the 50s, like Connor Woolrich and Patricia Highsmith, they became very easy to adapt because of the way that they were writing in those sort of very cinematic ways, which was a very visual way. Now, it's certainly colonisation, and it's certainly an Alfred Hitchcock movie. Interesting here, we don't see Cornel Woolrich, It Had to Be Murder on this title card. We see in big, bold block letters, Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window. The fact that he changes the title of the short story from It Had to Be Murder to Rear Window does say something about what Hitchcock was wanting to do. He didn't want this considered to be an adaptation as such, or regarded or evaluated as an adaptation. He wanted this to be considered as an Alfred Hitchcock original, an Alfred Hitchcock work. And it's kind of interesting because Hitchcock never really gave much acknowledgement to the works he was adapting. He adapted his whole career. But because he wasn't, often for decades, people weren't really talking about Hitchcock and adaptation. In the last couple of years, there's been more attention to Hitchcock and his adaptations. But Hitchcock never really gave much due to the people he was adapting, and he was very, very indebted to them. If you look at this film, the structure of the short is the structure of the movie, and the central premise and the plot of the short is the central premise and plot of the movie. And pretty much what happens in the short happens in the movie. There's other things added, of course, but it's very, very indebted to what's going on. But at the same time, it is an Alfred Hitchcock movie, and you need to look no further than Hitchcock's interest in these one set movies, right? So think of Rope. Now, Rope, in my opinion, isn't really a successful movie. This was Hitchcock's idea, where he thought, I'm going to get two guys and they're going to murder someone and they're going to have a party around the dead body, right? And it's going to be set in one room in an apartment. And more than that, I'm going to have no cuts in the film. So it's going to be just one continuous camera, right? And that's his movie. It didn't really work, but he loves the idea of the one set movies. You know, you see it again in Psycho, which is kind of not one space, but it's certainly one place kind of movie. It's set, it's set at the Bates Motel, of course. A Rear Window is another example of it, where the film happens from Jeff's apartment, and he really liked that whole idea. And this film can be easily tied to those other sort of one place or one space Hitchcock movies, as well, of course, as him working with Jimmy Stewart again. He's worked with Grace Kelly again. So there's those recurring motifs, the theme of murder, the theme of guilt. All of that is very much in this film that we see across Hitchcock's career. Now, it is parody. And if you actually think of the short story and Sam, so Sam is the black sort of house boy or housemaid or house servant, I suppose, is a better way of thinking of him. And the thing is, Jeff in the short story, he asks Sam to do ridiculous things. He never gives him any reason, any backstory. There's no payoff really for Sam, apart from him saying to Sam at one point, "Well, we've worked together for 10 years, so do this for me, Sam. Thank you very much. Go over to this apartment where I think a man's murdered his wife, and I want you to break in." And and then he says to him at one point, "You could be risking your life, and you could end up getting a bullet." And Sam, without even blinking, just does it. And it just seems a bit ridiculous. And what you've actually got in Rear Window is Lisa is the one that ends up going over to the apartment. But Lisa has a reason, because Lisa's trying to get Jeff's attention. And Jeff's not interested in looking at her. Jeff's looking at everything else around her, but not her. So by her going over, Jeff will be looking at her. Jeff will be concentrating on her. And what happens in the film, which is kind of interesting, is once she risks her life for Jeff, then Jeff becomes interested in her. Then Jeff becomes aroused by her. It's very, very kind of interesting, that character play between those two characters. Anyway, back to Stella. We don't have Sam, we have Stella. And we have Stella played by the brilliant Thelma Ritter. And Thelma Ritter was a fantastic character actor. She played many, many parts. You may have seen her in a number of films across the sort of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. She was really fantastic, and she brings great comedy to this performance, where she is the housekeeper but she's kind of this really macabre and morbid. She's got this really macabre and morbid fascination with murder, and she kind of likes the whole idea of it, and she gets really interested and involved in it. And different to Sam, who Sam's just kind of ordered around in the short story. In the movie, Stella and Jeff have this kind of great banter with one another, and it's really a lot of fun. And Thelma really brings great humour and great kind of parody to the performance, which again makes Rear Window such a joy to watch. It's very much adjustment, right? So what we've got here is the way that it's fleshing out the short story. So in the short story, right, what you essentially have is Jeff thinking he's seen a murder across the way, and that's it. They're the only two characters, really, apart from Sam and a policeman that he calls up. Right, that's it. Now, look at the title card for the movie and how many characters and actors there are being credited in this title card. It's because what he's actually able to do, in all the apartments, we see a different story. It's like a different melodrama that's being played out. So you've got Miss Torso, who's just kind of waiting for a boyfriend to come home. You've got Miss Lonely Hearts, who just wants a date, who wants to fall in love. Her end is quite tragic. You have a newly married couple who their curtains are always down. I don't have to tell you why. Newly married couple. You have a composer who, this is really interesting. So the composer's working on a piece which he's finding very hard to kind of complete. And across the film, he's writing different parts of it, and he's playing different parts of it. And by the very end of it, he's worked it out, and he's got his score. And the score that he writes is actually the score for the film, right? So there's all these different things that are happening in all of the apartments. So it's not just one apartment where something interesting is happening. Something interesting is happening in every single apartment. And what Hitchcock does is he shows you those melodramas, and he shows you those soap operas from all of those different apartments, which is really, really, really fantastic. And it keeps the plot ticking over, and it keeps the interest ticking over, because it's not just about one story, it's about many, many multiple stories, but he never cuts away from that, and that's what's really interesting about it. Also, speaking of cutting away, what's really great is the camera, and the camera takes on its own point of view. There's an image in the, so Jimmy Stewart's watching Raymond Burr across the way, and it's late at night, and Jimmy Stewart falls asleep, and instead of the camera sort of fading to black, it stays there, and it watches across at his apartment. And what we see, what Jimmy Stewart doesn't see because he's fallen asleep, is Raymond Burr, he gets his hat, he gets a briefcase, and he leaves, and then he comes back, right? And in this time, Jimmy Stewart's been asleep. Jimmy Stewart thinks Raymond Burr's been in his apartment the whole time, but we know he hasn't. So suddenly we're involved. We have information that Jeff doesn't. It's really, really brilliantly done. And that's the thing about this film. It gives you this information just through the camera and what it shows and what it doesn't, and it's playing around with point of view that the short story doesn't do. And prose would struggle to do that if you actually think about how would you actually write that. So it's really, really interesting what the film's able to do. Okay, so some final thought. When watching Rear Window, think about the following. Jeff's backstory. How do we see his backstory, right? How does the camera show his backstory? What do we learn about him? His own anxiety, his own issues with commitment, his own relationship with Lisa. This is all through the camera, and what the camera is actually able to show you. That prose, it would struggle to write this in a short story to bring out everything that's in the film in this short story. How can James Stewart reveal things in his performance that prose has to describe in great detail? So Jimmy Stewart was a very technical and a very nuanced sort of performer, and he's able to actually give you expressions and give you things in his own performance which give you a sense of who he is as an individual and as a person that you just don't get in the short story. The short story, it's a very matter-of-fact kind of character that we're talking about here. And finally, fashion, and the way that Hitchcock uses fashion. Something Hitchcock should be discussed about more is just his fashion of his characters and what you actually get from the characters, especially Grace Kelly, who has these unbelievable dresses that she wears across the film. She wears sort of lingerie and big ball gowns. She's just going to her boyfriend's house, but she's always wearing these unbelievable gowns. and like she brings the lingerie on because she's planning to stay the night. If you know where I'm going with that, I don't think she plans to sleep on the couch, and it's just Hitchcock's way of actually revealing certain things about these characters and who they are and what they want from each other. And it's really interesting that you also get this backstory just through the fashion. And these are kinds of things that you can't get in prose. It's very hard to get in prose, that you just don't get in because of course you'd have to stop the plot, and you have to stop the flow, and you have to start describing these things. It's a lot easier to do in film, and that's what I want to concentrate on. That often when we talk about adaptation, we're talking about film being a lesser form of adaptation. But what I think Rear Window is a great example of, it's the better form of adaptation because it can show you things that prose can't. Okay, let's leave it there. I hope you enjoy, in my opinion, one of the great masterpieces in the history of cinema, Rear Window. I hope you enjoy reading the short, which I think is really good. There's some interesting things in it, and I hope you enjoy seeing the film, which I've got a great copy on Blu-ray, which I think is going to look just really incredible on the big screen. Okay, enjoy and see you soon.